It's good to have you with us. I'm Daniel Chef for Arirang News. Let's start with the headlines. On this, the 65th anniversary of the start of the Korean War, South Koreans hold special ceremonies to pay tribute to all who fought for the nation's freedom and democracy. As anticipated, President Park Geun-hye vetoes revisions to the National Assembly law that grants Parliament power to request changes to even presidential orders, saying it could lead to the separation of powers as regulated by the Constitution. To keep Korea's economic growth in the 3% range, to counter the economic fallout from the current MERS outbreak and to mitigate damages from the drought, the Korean government plans to set aside more than $13.5 billion. Today, June 25, 2015, marks 65 years since the start of the Korean War. A commemorative ceremony took place in southern Seoul earlier in the day to remember that fateful day. Our Connie Kim spoke with some of those in attendance, many of whom still cling to the hope of a reunified Korea.
When North Korean forces invaded South Korea 65 years ago, no one knew it would signal the start of a bitter divide on the peninsula. To pay tribute to the sacrifices of the war fallen, Korea's Ministry of Patriots and Veterans Affairs invited thousands of war veterans, diplomatic envoys from combatant nations, and citizens. Prime Minister Hwang Kyo-ahn used the podium to emphasize the importance of having strong security in the South, while also encouraging the two Koreas to make efforts for a peaceful reunification.
Seoul is preparing for a reunified Korea by establishing a unification preparation committee. I hope North Korea, as a responsible member of the international society, will walk the path towards co-prosperity.
More than 6 decades may have passed since the war broke out, but for those who fought in the conflict, vivid memories of the war still linger in their minds.
When we were marching towards the north, I walked with my eyes shut because I couldn't sleep for such a long time. I also remember not being able to take my shoes off for almost a week.
21 UN member nations fought in the Korean War, roughly 2 million military personnel deployed to South Korea during the conflict.
We sent 85,000 troops to fight the war and lost 1,500. So it was a very meaningful event this morning to remember the veterans.
As the world's only divided country, most veterans, diplomatic envoys, and citizens at the ceremony expressed their yearning to see a peaceful reunification and a new chapter in Korea's history. Connie Kim, Arirang News.
The Korean War started when forces from the Communist North launched a surprise attack on the South. Our Park Ji-won gives us a brief summary of a conflict that cost so many lives and left a nation divided to this day.
The Korean War began with some 75,000 North Korean forces crossing the 38th parallel, the border that divided Soviet-backed North Korea and pro-Western South Korea on the early morning of June 25th in 1950, 65 years ago. North Korean tanks reached the outskirts of the South Korean capital Seoul the next day. Within a few days, the city was taken by communist forces. In the following 3 months, they conquered nearly all of the Korean peninsula, except for some deep southern regions like Daegu and Busan. Eventually, the tide turned with the help of U.S. and UN forces. Western powers saw North Korea's attack as part of the rising threat of communism. The UN sent in allied forces composed of troops from 15 countries to stop the communist advance. On September 15th, General Douglas MacArthur, Commander-in-Chief of United Nations Command, successfully carried out the Incheon landing operation, restoring the South Korean capital Seoul in late September. And by the end of October, the Allied forces were nearly able to push back the battle lines to the northernmost provinces of the peninsula. It seemed like the war would soon end, but with a sudden massive intervention of communist Chinese soldiers backing North Korea in late 1950, Seoul was retaken by communist forces in January the following year. After that, the war became a bloody stalemate, Allied forces fought back and retook Seoul in mid-March of 1951, but the warring continued and the casualties grew. And that's when the U.S. began examining a ceasefire. American officials first proposed the idea to Russia in May 1951. After some 2 more years of negotiations and ongoing hostilities, an armistice treaty was finally signed in July 1953, bringing the bitter fighting to an end. The 3-year war, which was the first major military action of the Cold War between the Western powers and communist countries, cost the lives of some 5 million people, both armed forces and civilians, and left the Korean peninsula divided almost the same as before the war. Park Ji-won, Arirang News.
Families separated by the Korean War wait in increasingly desperate anticipation to see their long-lost relatives one last time, as they're mostly in their twilight years. They all hang on to the hope that the two governments can put their differences aside for a while and restart reunions. Our Kim Yeon-bin met with one separated family member to hear her story.
I went through countless restless nights thinking about my family and hometown. It all comes back to me suddenly.
65 years have passed since the start of the Korean War. But 86-year-old Pyun Yeon-suk is still searching for her lost siblings in the north. She was separated from her family in Hwanghae-do province in North Korea when she was 18 years old, just a week before the Korean War began on June 25, 1950. Decades have passed, but Pyun has yet to hear any news of her 2 younger brothers and sister in North Korea.
Unification is my sincerest wish. I want to visit my hometown. I'm over 80 years old, so I don't have much longer to live. Hopefully Korea will be unified. I just want to find out if my siblings are still alive.
Pyun settled down in Seoul after the war and started her own family, now a proud grandmother. But the thought of her siblings bring her to tears even today. Pyun is one of tens of thousands of separated family members here in Korea, desperate to hear any news of their families. Since 2000, there were 19 reunions of separated families between the 2 Koreas. But it all came to a halt in February of 2014, as tensions between the 2 countries have escalated. There are roughly 130,000 listed as separated family members in South Korea. But time is of the essence, as nearly half are no longer alive. Around 67,000 separated family members are still alive, desperately waiting for inter-Korean relations to improve, so they might have a chance to reunite with their long-lost family members once again.
I hope the South Korean government will put more interest towards the separated families. They are not concerned about us these days. There is no news about separated families in the media, nor is the government doing anything about it.
Kim Yeon-bin, Arirang News.
Moving on to other stories, President Park Geun-hye has vetoed revisions to the National Assembly law that gives the parliament power to request changes to ordinances, including presidential orders. It is the first time President Park has vetoed an assembly-approved bill. Our Choi Yu-sun has this report.
Before the cabinet decided to call on the National Assembly to again discuss the disputed bill, President Park sternly explained that she had no other choice but to veto due to concerns over what she deemed administrative paralysis. She said giving the parliament power to request changes to ordinances infringes on the government's and the judicial branch's authority and therefore could be unconstitutional.
이 개정안은 국가 행정 체계와 사법 체계를 흔들 수 있는 주요한 사안으로 여야의 주고받기식이나 충분한 검토 없이 서둘러서 진행할 사안이 아닙니다.
The president said it's apparent the ruling and opposition political parties rushed the passage of the bill, citing that lawmakers are unclear about whether the request requires mandatory action by the government. She also took aim at the parliament for neglecting the people while prioritizing bills for political gain. President Park accused lawmakers of repeatedly blaming the government for not doing enough instead of passing bills aimed at revitalizing the economy and improving the people's livelihoods. In a rare move, the president targeted the ruling party floor leader, the chief negotiator for the bill and regular critic of her policies. Questioning the efforts of Yoo Seung-min in gaining parliamentary support for economic policies, President Park said politics is not something that can be used for one's political philosophy or logic. By exercising her veto power, the president has risked a head-on confrontation with the parliament and with both the rival political parties. Analysts say it was a practical move as she couldn't have allowed the parliament to meddle in her running of state affairs, especially as she comes close to the midpoint of her presidency. Choi Yu-san, Arirang News.
And the ball is back in the National Assembly's court on whether to put the revised National Assembly Act up for a vote again. The ruling Century Party said they respect the president's decision to veto the revised law. However, the main opposition New Politics Alliance for Democracy said the president had shown no respect for Parliament and vowed to halt all legislative affairs until the rejected law is put up for another vote. Assembly Speaker Chung Yoo-hwa conveyed his willingness for a revote. Under Korea's constitution, lawmakers can hold another vote on a law that's been vetoed by the president. A two-thirds majority is needed to override the veto. If the vote falls short of that majority, the law will be scrapped. Moving on to the updates on the MERS situation here in Korea, the health ministry has confirmed on Thursday that 2 more patients have died from the virus, raising the country's death toll to 29. A new case of the virus has also been confirmed today after a patient tested positive at the Good Gangwon Hospital in Busan. The victim reportedly caught the virus while sharing the same hospital room with a MERS patient who wasn't diagnosed with the disease at the time. This takes the total number of confirmed MERS cases to 180. The health ministry added that out of the 180 MERS patients, 77 are currently in the hospital, with 62 of them in stable condition. On a brighter note, the number of quarantine has dropped by more than 460 overnight, bringing down the total to 2,642. Since the MERS outbreak began late last month, more than 14,000 people have been under quarantine, with nearly 12,000 released so far. The Finance Ministry rolled out plans for the second half of the year. That includes pumping 15 trillion won into the Korean economy, which the government hopes will keep the country's growth in the 3% range. Our Shin Se-min gives us the details.
The Finance Ministry announced plans to inject more than 15 trillion won, or $13.6 billion into the economy to keep the country's growth in the 3% range. Finance Minister Choi Kyung-hwan said Thursday that the supplementary budget will help counter the economic fallout from the current MERS outbreak and damages from the drought.
The government will mobilize all available financial resources, including the planned additional budget and other state funds, to spur the economy.
The minister added that it was too early to confirm the exact size of the supplementary budget as the impact of the MERS outbreak is still being monitored. Some say even the extra budget may not be enough.
Although the supplementary budget was a much-needed boost to our economy, usually only 60 to 70% of the budget is actually reflected.
In the biannual economic outlook, the Finance Ministry lowered its forecast to 3.1% this year, down from its previous projection of 3.8%. Korea saw its exports contract over 5.5% on year in the first 5 months of this year, and the unexpected MERS outbreak is estimated to have played a role in lowering the annual economic growth by 0.2 to 3 percentage points.
The government added that it will announce alternative measures by the end of next month on the country's key pending issues, including the staggering youth unemployment rate and the country's sliding exports. Shin Se-min, Arirang News.
Whether it's the Burj Khalifa in the United Arab Emirates or the Marina Bay Sands in Singapore, some of the world's tallest and most remarkable buildings can be credited to Korean engineers. This year marks 50 years since Korea's first successful overseas construction bid. And for a look back at Korea's overseas construction accomplishments and its prospects for the future, we turn to our Song Ji-sun.
Korean engineers won its first overseas construction bid in 1965. A $5 million highway project in Thailand. Since then, they've made history, along with some of the world's most famous landmarks, like the Burj Khalifa in the United Arab Emirates, currently the world's tallest building. Unlike the early stages when orders were mostly from the Middle East,
Korean engineers have broadened their clientele, hitting the accumulated figure of $700 billion last week. Marking the 50 years of construction achievements on Thursday, President Park encouraged engineers to take on greater business opportunities, utilizing Korea's advanced technologies such as smart cities incorporating IT technicians. She also called on the industry to actively engage in infrastructure projects in emerging economies in Southeast Asia and South America. Through such efforts, it's anticipated that Korea will hit the $1 trillion mark for overseas construction in the near future. Currently accounting for about 8% of the global construction market share, Korea is ranked 6th behind Spain, China, the US, France, and Germany. 송지선, Arirang News.
Well, North Korea is ramping up pressure after the opening of a UN office in Seoul aimed at monitoring the regime's human rights abuses. The visiting human rights chief said it is good that Pyongyang is reacting. Wrapping up his 3-day stay in Seoul, UN High Commissioner for Human Rights Zaid Ra'ad Al Hussein said the angry reactions by North Korea are signs that it is making more effort to engage with the issues raised by the international community. He said the UN office in Seoul will not only monitor and document human rights violation in the north, but also engage with civil society, refugees and defectors, and with the governments of the region. South Korean Foreign Minister Yoon Byung-se called on North Korea to return to the stalled six-party nuclear talks, saying its nuclear ambitions will only lead to further isolation. Speaking at the opening ceremony of a meeting of the group of eminent persons for the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty in Seoul on Thursday, Yoon pointed out that Pyongyang is the only country to have conducted nuclear tests in the 21st century. He said nukes will bring nothing but isolation and sanctions, and urged the North to follow Iran's example, which is nearing a deal to curb its nuclear program in exchange for the lifting of sanctions. And that does it for us. Thank you so much for watching.